Sometimes the plans of men shatter like glass on the desert floor, and all that remains are the cutting shards of reality. Thomas Mitchell watched the carriage approach through the dust that danced in the warm afternoon air. His eyes, marked by the sun and loneliness of the last 10 years, followed the slow movement of the wheels on the dry land. The farm he had built with his own hands stretched around him as a testament to his determination. But on that September afternoon, all he could think about was the folded letter in his shirt pocket. The letter that would change your life forever. The correspondence with Margaret Sullivan had lasted 6 months. 6 months of carefully chosen words, of promises exchanged across hundreds of miles, of shared dreams about a life together in those barren lands. She was 22, she had written, a teacher in a small town in the east, and she was willing to trade the security of civilization for the adventure of building something new in the west. Thomas was 43 years old and knew that men like him did not have the luxury of waiting for love. They had to build it as they built their houses and their enclosures. The wind blew hard, kicking up swirls of sand that danced among the cacti before breaking into nothingness. Thomas adjusted his hat and walked toward the property's main gate. The carriage was closer now, and he could see the coachman bent over the reins, fighting the heat that made the horses gasp. But something was wrong. Thomas knew well enough about expectations to know when they were about to crumble. When the carriage finally stopped before him, it was not Margaret Sullivan who got off. It was a younger woman, with golden hair that the sun had faded into straw hues, and green eyes that carried an urgency he had never seen in a correspondence. She wore a simple but clean dress, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small brown leather suitcase. "Mr. Mitchell." Her voice was soft, but charged with a determination that cut through the hot air like a blade. "My name is Sarah Sullivan. I'm Margaret's sister." Thomas felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. The words he had prepared to receive his mail-order bride dissolved in his throat like sugar in the rain. The coachman remained in his place, waiting for instructions, while the horses shook their heads, eager to find shade and water. "Where's your sister?" The words came out drier than the desert wind. Sarah squinted for a moment, as if gathering courage from somewhere deep inside her. When he lifted them up again, Thomas saw something he immediately recognized, the look of someone who had lost everything and was betting on the last move he had left. "Margaret got married last week, with the merchant of the city." Each word was pronounced with the precision of someone who had rehearsed that confession throughout the long journey. "She asked me to come in her place, to explain, and to ask if you would consider taking me as a wife." The silence that followed was as heavy as the heat rising from the earth. Thomas looked at the woman before him, saw the despair carefully hidden behind dignity, saw the courage that had brought her there. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that shattered plans sometimes reveal possibilities that had never been considered. The wind blew again, stronger this time, and Thomas realized that his life had just taken a turn he could never have imagined. Thomas studied Sarah Sullivan's face like a man scans the horizon for signs of a storm. There was something about her that Margaret had never mentioned in her letters, a quiet strength that seemed to have been forged in fire more intense than anything the desert could offer. The coachman cleared his throat, reminding them that time and the thirst of horses did not wait for decisions of the heart. "Come in," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to accept the surprises that life presented to him. "Horses need water, and we need to talk." Sarah followed him along the stone path that led to the main house. It was a solid building, made of wood and stone, with a wide veranda that offered shade on scorching days. Thomas had built that house thinking of a family, of children's laughter echoing through the walls, of a woman who would bring life to those quiet rooms. Now, watching Sarah walk beside him, he realized that perhaps his dreams had not died, just changed shape. Inside the house, the temperature was more bearable. Thomas pointed to a chair by the window, where an occasional breeze brought relief from the heat. Sarah sat with the upright posture of someone who had learned that dignity was sometimes the only thing no one could take away from a person. She put the suitcase on the floor next to the chair and put her hands in her lap. "I need you to tell me everything," said Thomas, pouring 2 glasses of fresh water from an earthenware jug. "About Margaret, about you, about why it's here." Sarah accepted the water with a nod of thanks and drank slowly, as if savoring every drop. When he finished, he put the glass on the table and looked Thomas straight in the eye. "Margaret met Jonathan Hayes at the beginning of the summer. He owns a fabric store and has a house on the main street. She said she could no longer imagine living so far from civilization." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "She asked me to come and explain in person, so that you would know that it was not out of dishonor or disrespect." Thomas nodded slowly. He knew well the power that civilization exerted over some people, the promise of paved streets and corner shops. He couldn't blame Margaret for choosing safety over the uncertainty of the West. "And you?" he asked. "Why did you agree to come?" Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment, and when she raised them again, Thomas saw a whole story of hardship and loss written on her green irises. "Our father died last winter. He left debts. The house had to be sold to pay off creditors." His voice remained steady, but Thomas noticed how his fingers tightened slightly. "Margaret had Jonathan to marry. I only had the savings I saved working as a seamstress, and they weren't enough to start a new life on my own." The wind slammed against the window, causing the glass to vibrate slightly. Thomas then understood that Sarah Sullivan had not just come to explain her sister's absence. She had come because it was her only chance to escape poverty and helplessness. It was a desperate gamble disguised as courtesy. "You know how to sew," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and cooking, taking care of a house, dealing with small animals. I learned all of this by helping my mother before she died." Sarah straightened up in her chair. "I know I'm not Margaret. I know you didn't choose me, but I can be a good wife, Mr. Mitchell. I can work hard and be loyal." Thomas got up and walked to the window. Outside, the coachman had taken the horses to the watering trough and was now resting in the shade of the carriage. The sun began to decline over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that made the desert look like a sea of fire. He thought of Margaret, of the woman he had imagined by his side for months of correspondence. Then he thought of Sarah, sitting in her living room, offering herself as a substitute not out of love, but out of necessity. There was a brutal honesty in that proposal that touched him in an unexpected way. "Where will you sleep tonight?" he asked without turning from the window. "The coachman said that there is a hotel in the nearest town. I can pay for one night." Sarah's voice carried a quiet determination that impressed Thomas. He turned to face her. Here was a woman who had lost everything, traveled hundreds of miles into uncharted territory, and was now offering her life to a stranger. There was a courage in that which few men he knew possessed. "Sarah Sullivan," he said finally, "I accept your proposal." Thomas's words hung in the air of the room like cigarette smoke, loaded with weight and consequence. Sarah remained motionless for a long moment, as if she needed to make sure she had heard correctly. The relief that crossed his face was as subtle as the shadow of a cloud passing through the sun, but Thomas noticed it. It was the look of someone who had bet everything on a single card and found that he did not lose the game. Thomas watched her for a few moments before heading to the desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer and pulled out some papers, documents he had prepared for Margaret, but which would now be useful for Sarah. Marriage contracts were practical affairs in the West, where survival depended more on clear agreements than romantic promises. As he arranged the papers, Thomas explained the conditions he had in mind. Sarah would listen carefully, asking questions only when necessary. She would take care of the house, help with the chickens and pigs, do the mending and repairs of clothes that a man alone could never keep up with. He would provide food, shelter, protection, and a small monthly amount of money for his personal needs. The back room would be hers, until they both decided if that arrangement could turn into something deeper. Sarah nodded for each condition presented. Thomas realized that she not only agreed, but seemed genuinely relieved that there were clear boundaries set. For a woman who had lost everything and found herself at the mercy of the kindness of strangers, the predictability of a well-defined arrangement must have seemed a priceless luxury. The sun was setting when they finished discussing the practical details. Thomas informed the coachman that he could leave the next day after a night's rest. The man would settle in the barn, as was the custom for travelers in those isolated lands. Sarah spent the first night in her new home, exploring the room that would be hers. It was simple but clean, with an iron bed, a small chest of drawers, and a window that overlooked the fields where Thomas raised cattle. She arranged her few clothes on the dresser and placed her family's photograph on the bedside table. It was all that was left of his previous life. In the kitchen, she found the basic utensils and some groceries. Thomas had prepared to receive a wife, and that included stocking the pantry with flour, beans, sugar, and other essential ingredients. Sarah made a mental inventory of what she would need to transform that house into a functional home. During the days that followed, a routine began to take hold. Thomas would leave before dawn to tend the cattle, and Sarah would prepare breakfast before the sun even came up on the horizon. She washed clothes in the tank behind the house, mended the shirts that hard work had torn, and kept the house clean and organized. The conversations between them were brief and practical. Thomas commented on the weather and the animals. Sarah asked about ingredients she needed to buy on her next trip to the city. There was no intimacy, but there was no tension either. It was as if they had both accepted that this was a trial period, a chance to find out if two strangers could build a life together based on mutual respect and shared need. Thomas watched Sarah work and was impressed by her efficiency. She wasted no movement or materials. She did each task with the concentration of someone who had learned that a job well done was the difference between safety and helplessness. There was a quiet grace in his gestures that he hadn't expected to find. Sarah, in turn, studied Thomas when he wasn't looking. He noticed the scars on his hands, marks of years of hard work. She saw how he treated animals firmly, but without cruelty. She noticed that he always checked to see if she had eaten before serving herself, a small gesture of courtesy that spoke of a character that his letters to Margaret had never fully revealed. A week after Sarah's arrival, Thomas realized that his home had become different, not just cleaner or organized, but more alive. There was the smell of fresh bread in the morning, clean curtains on the windows, and wildflowers in a pitcher on the kitchen table. Sarah had begun to transform that functional space into something that looked like a home, and for the first time since Margaret had broken her heart by correspondence, Thomas allowed himself to think that perhaps the shattered plans might give rise to something even better than he had imagined. The weeks passed like water running across dry land, leaving subtle but permanent marks on both of their lives. Thomas discovered that Sarah possessed talents that went beyond basic domestic skills. She could read clouds to predict storms, knew herbs that could heal small wounds in animals, and had a natural intuition for numbers that made her control the finances of the house with a precision that he had never been able to. The first crisis came in early October, when one of the dairy cows became ill. Thomas found the animal prostrate in the field, refusing to eat, with dull eyes that heralded serious trouble. He knew that losing that cow would mean less milk, less cheese, and consequently less money to get through the winter. Sarah appeared by his side without making a sound, as she had developed the habit of doing. She watched the animal for a few minutes, then knelt on the ground and examined the cow's feet carefully. His hands moved safely, touching and pressing different points as he muttered low observations. She stood up with dirt on the knees of her dress and walked back to the house. Thomas followed her, curious and slightly skeptical. Sarah went directly to the cupboard where she kept the spices and dried herbs, selected a few ingredients, and began to prepare a mixture that smelled like mint and something stronger that he couldn't identify. For the next 3 days, Sarah cared for the sick cow with the dedication of a mother caring for a sick child. She prepared the herbal mixtures, administered the medicines, and spent long hours sitting next to the animal, speaking softly as if her words could speed recovery. Thomas watched everything with growing admiration. There was a patience in Sarah that he rarely saw in other people, an ability to persist even when the results didn't show up immediately. On the third day, the cow got up on her own, walked to the watering trough, and drank water for the first time since she had become ill. From that moment on, something changed between them. It was not a sudden or dramatic transformation, but a subtle change in the way they looked at each other, how they divided tasks, how they shared the silence of meals. Thomas began asking Sarah for her opinion on farm decisions, and she began offering suggestions without being asked. One afternoon, while they were repairing a broken fence together, Thomas noticed how Sarah held the boards in place without him having to ask. It was as if she anticipated his movements, understood the rhythm of his work, even before he explained what needed to be done. They worked in sync, two people who had learned to function as an efficient team. Autumn brought the first frosts, and with them, the need to prepare the house for the harsh winter that was to come. Sarah was tireless in her preparation. She pickled the last vegetables in the garden, dried medicinal herbs, and sewed extra blankets using scraps of fabric she had brought from her previous life. Thomas watched her work and realized that Sarah had become indispensable not only to the running of the house, but to her own sense of well-being. I came home eager to see what she had prepared for dinner, to hear her observations about the animals, to share the small triumphs and worries of the day. One night, after a particularly difficult day in which they had lost 3 chickens to a fox, Thomas found Sarah sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars. She didn't cry for the lost animals, but he noticed a quiet sadness in her posture, a melancholy that spoke of all the losses she had accumulated throughout her life. Thomas sat next to her, saying nothing, just sharing the silent contemplation of the starry night. The air was cold, and he noticed how Sarah curled slightly against the wind. Without thinking too much about the gesture, Thomas took off his coat and placed it on her shoulders. Sarah looked at him in surprise, then smiled for the first time since she had arrived at the farm. It wasn't a big or dramatic smile, but genuine and warm, and Thomas felt something move in his chest, an emotion he'd forgotten how to identify. That night, as each retired to their respective rooms, they both realized that the practical arrangement they had established had quietly transformed into something deeper. Respect had evolved into admiration. Admiration had become affection, and affection was slowly blossoming into territory neither had dared to explore yet. Winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Thomas Mitchell didn't fear the loneliness of the cold months. And Sarah Sullivan, who had arrived as someone else's replacement, began to realize that perhaps she had found exactly the place where she should have always been. Winter arrived with all its fury, turning the landscape into a sea of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. Snow fell for 3 consecutive days, isolating the farm from the rest of the world and forcing Thomas and Sarah to completely depend on each other. These were days that tested not only their ability to survive, but also the feelings that had quietly grown between them. During the long nights when the wind howled outside the windows, they would sit next to the wood-burning stove, he repairing harnesses and she sewing by candlelight. The conversations had become more frequent and personal. Sarah told about her childhood, about the dreams she had to abandon when her father died. Thomas spoke of his loneliness, of the years he built the farm waiting for a family that never arrived. One morning, Thomas woke up to find that the storm had collapsed part of the barn's roof. The snow was piling dangerously on the animals, and he knew he would have to climb onto the icy ceiling to make repairs, even at the risk of slipping and seriously injuring himself. Sarah appeared at his side with ropes and tools before he even asked for help. She held onto the ropes as he climbed, her eyes never moving away from him, ready to react at the first sign of danger. When a plank gave way under Thomas's weight and he nearly fell, it was Sarah who pulled the rope hard enough to stabilize him. At that moment, hanging between safety and fall, Thomas understood that his life was literally in the hands of that woman who had arrived as a substitute for another. After the roof was repaired and they both warmed up indoors, Thomas looked at Sarah with a new intensity. She had snow in her hair, and her cheeks red with cold, but her eyes shone with a vitality that made him realize how essential she had become to his existence. That night, Thomas knocked softly on Sarah's bedroom door. When she opened it, he saw his own uncertainty reflected in her face, but he also saw hope. With no elaborate words or grandiose statements, he reached out to her. Sarah stared at the outstretched hand for a long moment, then intertwined her fingers with his. It was simply in this way that marriage of convenience became a true union. There was no formal ceremony that night, just two people who had learned to trust each other by deciding that they wanted to share not only responsibilities, but also dreams and fears. Spring arrived as a promise fulfilled, melting the snow and revealing a renewed earth. Sarah, now installed in the master bedroom next to Thomas, worked in the vegetable garden she had planted behind the house. She had asked for seed on her last trip to the city, and now neat rows of vegetables were growing under her care. Thomas watched her from the field where she was branding cattle, admiring how she had transformed not only the farm, but also his own life. The woman who had arrived desperate and vulnerable had become the center around which his entire existence orbited. One day, while they were tidying up the pantry together, Sarah suddenly stopped and put her hand on her belly. Thomas noticed the gesture and saw something in his eyes that made his heart race. She didn't say anything at that moment, but she didn't need to. Some truths were communicated through looks and smiles, not through words. In the months that followed, as Sarah's body began to show signs of the new life growing inside her, Thomas realized that he had received much more than a replacement for Margaret Sullivan. He had received a companion who understood the value of hard work, a woman who knew how to turn a house into a home, and now the future mother of his children. Sarah, for her part, understood that her desperate journey west had not just been an escape from poverty. It had been a way to find the place where she should always have been, next to a man who valued her not for what she represented to others, but for what she was for herself. One summer afternoon, as Thomas was returning from the fields, he found Sarah sitting on the porch, sewing small clothes for the baby who would be born in the fall. The golden afternoon sun lit up his serene face, and Thomas paused for a moment just to take in the perfection of that moment. Sometimes men's plans fall apart to make room for something infinitely better. Thomas Mitchell had commissioned a bride and welcomed a family. Sarah Sullivan had offered convenience and discovered true love. And together they had built something neither of them could have imagined when she stepped out of that dusty carriage months earlier, carrying only a suitcase and a desperate hope. The wind blew gently across the property, carrying the scent of the flowers Sarah had planted near the house. It was a different wind from the one that had witnessed her arrival, softer, warmer, as if even nature approved of the union that had been born of despair and blossomed into true love. If you enjoyed this exciting Wild West story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our epic narratives.